After harnessing the winds and the waves and the tides and the gravitation, we shall harness for God the energies of love. And on that day, for the second time in the history of the world, we will have discovered fire. When I read those words in another translation, as a Jesuit novice, I was hooked on Teilhard. And so it is my pleasure to initiate our conversation this afternoon and welcome you to Georgetown. I'm Kevin O'Brien. I'm Vice President for Mission and Ministry, and on behalf of President DeGioia, I want to welcome our community here at Georgetown and our friends and neighbors and visiting scholars to our conversation on Teilhard, his importance in the 21st century. Teilhard, we know, died about 60 years ago on Easter Sunday, 1955. And as Frank Frost will share with us, and our panel will share with us today, he died in largely unrecognized by the Society of Jesus and society at large, but that would soon change. For 5 years later, after his death, his books would become published. And then 10 years later, his fame would be worldwide and transformative both in the church and in the sciences and society at large, particularly with the energy unleashed within and outside the church during and after Vatican II. And we know that Teilhard worked so much to reconcile religion and science, evolution and faith, an understanding of Christ and Christology with his understanding of how the world operates by God's natural laws. And so his influence has continued for over 60 years in different phases. His fame diminished for a while, then returned, and now we are seeing a resurgence, a reinterest in all things Teilhard. There is some special connections that Georgetown has to Teilhard. Not only have we had some of the most distinguished scholars of Teilhard teach and work here or visit here, but as a Jesuit, we know that when he was alive, we can count on at least 2 occasions when Teilhard stayed overnight at the Jesuit community. We are still waiting for his per diem check to arrive. His good friend, Lucille Swan, lived just down the street here during the last 20 years of her life. The country's and perhaps the world's largest collection of Teilhard's papers and all things Teilhard are found at our Lauinger Library, in the Woodstock Theological Library, and in the special collections. And Teilhard's great niece came to Georgetown a couple of years ago to do research from these archives. When I was a student here in the 1980s, Father Tom King, known to many of us in this room, taught and preached Teilhard. He was a preeminent scholar in the U.S. and famous for his presentation of the Mass on the World. On the 50th anniversary of Teilhard's death, Georgetown hosted a similar gathering, and Tom was very much invested in that. And as far as we know today, today's gathering on the 60th anniversary is the only such gathering happening in the U.S., though we understand there are other gatherings outside this country. Soon we will be gifted with a documentary shown on PBS, which Frank Frost and Mary Frost, his business colleague and better half, are in the process of producing a documentary which will reintroduce or introduce for the first time Teilhard to a much larger audience. And so we are delighted to have you all here today, which should be a very enlightening and engaging conversation for all of us. And so to introduce our panel, I welcome Frank Frost here, who is known to many of us here. He is an award-winning independent television producer and is the director of the Teilhard de Chardin project. Along with Mary Frost, this project will bring to PBS a documentary on the life of Teilhard and the writings of Teilhard. Frank and Mary's work is known to us, perhaps most significantly in the fascinating and revealing documentary on Cardinal Bernardin, which he produced, and a project particularly important for us here at Georgetown, a documentary on the life of Pedro Arrupe, which he collaborated with Tony Moore on producing on behalf of Georgetown, and which is shared widely. So we are delighted to have Frank Frost's stewardship of our panel today, and I introduce Frank to you. Thank you, Frank.
Thank you, Kevin. It's very generous. I'm going to stay seated here because I'm going to ask the panel to stay seated when they make their short presentations, so I feel I should put myself in that same position. Before we begin the discussion, a few things need mentioning. First of all, I want to thank Georgetown University for hosting this event and following up on the event you did 10 years ago on the 50th anniversary of Teilhard's death. President Jack DeJoya instantly said yes to having this celebration when we broached it, the subject last fall. He was a great friend of Father Tom King and is himself a Teilhard enthusiast. All he had to do is persuade the rest of the university to go along with him. And he did. To our knowledge, this is the only event of its kind in the United States, although there are other 60th anniversary happenings all over the world. And we want to give special thanks to Sam Wagner and his colleagues in the Office of Catholic and Jesuit Initiatives, Interreligious Dialogue, in the Office of the President, which is Kevin O'Brien. Without him and without his colleagues, we would not be sitting here. And you mentioned the Lowinger Library Special Collections. We have up on the stage here, for those of you who can see it, there's a bust of Teilhard. Is that bronze? Whatever that material is. It's a bronze cast of Teilhard, cast by Melvina Hoffman, quite a famous sculptor working in the 40s and 50s. I have a little note here from Leon Hooper, the director of the Woodstock Library, of something that Melvina Hoffman said about Teilhard when he was posing for this. She said, his eyes would often smile and a cluster of tiny lines engraved their hieroglyphs on either side of his face, prolonging the downward slant to the corners of his upper lip and radiating a warm and loving nature. And she said that he recognized when he was sitting for the sculpting, saw how discouraged she became. And she said, he seemed to restore my confidence and carry my thoughts upward by the force of his own will and faith. Also, Leon has brought over from the library, Father Leon, a video, which is mostly shot by George Barber, a colleague of Teilhard. And also, if I'm right, Father Leon, I think this is a kind of a risque video. It's got 20 seconds of Teilhard skinny dipping in the Yellow River. But anyway, there's some goods back there, some Teilhardiana from the library. I think we missed the bells. They just stopped. I was told to be aware of the fact that at 3:15 the bells would be ringing in Healy because this is the 150th anniversary of the end of the Civil War, and all over the country bells are ringing at 3:15, rang at 3:15 to celebrate that. Georgetown had a special role to play in the Civil War by becoming a hospital, and same is true of Holy Trinity Parish. And we're told that actually the blue and gray colors of Georgetown came from the Civil War in a reconciliation of North and South. So if that's true, that's nice, isn't it? Why am I skeptical of these things? I know I'm running on, but let me tell you about an email that Mary and I received this morning today from Pierre and Jacqueline Francois. Pierre and Jacqueline live near Hyde Park, New York, and thus and not too far from the grave of Teilhard de Chardin. And for a number of years now, they've made it their personal responsibility to pay a quarterly visit to Teilhard's grave to landscape it. And with 4 faithful friends and devotees, they went yesterday morning to landscape the spring landscaping of Teilhard's grave for his birthday, death anniversary. And they want us to know that when they arrived to plant a bed of pansies, they found that someone had left a bouquet of pink roses, and the daffodils were pushing up through the hard, cold earth. They also found a rosary there at the grave, and any of you who've been to that site know that the top of his tombstone is loaded with stones of tribute. I also bring you greetings from the Teilhard family itself from France. Marie Bayon de la Tour, Teilhard's great niece and Secretary General of the Association of Nephews of Father Teilhard de Chardin, wanted to be here with us, but as it turns out, she's speaking today at a 60th anniversary event in Paris. Since we set out several years ago, Mary and I, to make a television documentary about Teilhard, and found it evolving into the Teilhard Project with its accompanying website, we've been touched and overwhelmed by the interest and support of people from many faiths and many countries around the world. The website, quite unexpectedly to us, emerged a community of people of interfaith and interreligious, and it's created our own little noosphere. And that involves a lot of the people in this room, as a matter of fact. And that reminds me, I'm glad to see that people are wearing name tags. Normally at events like this, Georgetown doesn't provide name tags, but we felt that this gathering was much more of a community than just an event. And the name tags will be particularly helpful when we get to the reception. We have people visiting here from distant places, from California, Canada, North Carolina, and Wisconsin, other places. But there are a couple of people that I want to mention by name. Cara Wood is here from California because she has a special stake in Teilhard and Georgetown through her great aunt, Lucille Swan. Lucille Swan, of course, is Teilhard's great friend. Cara is doing some biographical writing of her own and is taking advantage of Georgetown's library while she's here. Cara, could you just stand to say hello? Niels de Terra, did you arrive? I thought I saw you come in. Niels de Terra is the son of Teilhard's geological colleague Helmut de Terra. And Helmut was also married to Rhoda de Terra, who deserves to be mentioned at this time because it was in her New York apartment that Teilhard had a heart attack and died in 1955. Welcome, Niels. I have to say that Niels has published a graphic novel on Teilhard called something like, what's the title of your book, of your graphic novel? Okay. If you go to Amazon and Google Niels de Terra, you will find a graphic novel about Teilhard. So there's many other people in this room that I'd like to recognize, but this could go on forever. But we at least have to recognize the 2 members of the board of directors who are present, Dolores Leckie and Dennis Lucy. And there are also people here who represent some institutional members or collaborators of the project. And we have a substantial council of scholar advisors, starting with these 4 who are on this panel. And there are others in this room who are also part of that council. Maybe you'd like to stand. No? If you don't already are not already a stakeholder in the Teilhard Project, go to our website, teilhardproject.com, and sign up for our newsletter. Okay. One more piece of housekeeping, and then I'll get to what you came for. when we leave here, at 5 o'clock, we're presenting Mass on the World in the chapel in another part of this building. And I wanted to make sure it's not a misunderstanding. Don't plan to think you're going to Mass if you're going to this Mass on the World. It's not a Catholic liturgy. It's dramatic readings of excerpts from Teilhard's mystical essay, Mass on the World. And it's a multimedia presentation, so please come, but don't expect to be going to Mass. And at 6 o'clock, you're aware of the fact that there's a reception. The reception was originally planned for the Dahlgren quadrangle. It has now been moved because of the weather to Riggs Library, the super elegant library in Healy Hall. If you follow the crowd, you'll find where it is. A lot of people here know where it is. Okay, so you came to hear the panel. I'm going to introduce them all together, and then we'll give a talk. Let them give their talks. First of all, Jim Salmon. For those of you who got an early invitation to this event, Father James Salmon was listed on the panel, but he has had to withdraw because of health problems, which are not life-threatening, but are serious enough to keep him in a wheelchair in Baltimore. So starting on my far right here, John Haught is a distinguished research professor at Georgetown University, where he was formerly professor in the Department of Theology and its chair for 5 years. His area of specialization is systematic theology, with a particular interest in issues pertaining to science, cosmology, evolution, ecology, and religion. He received his doctorate from Catholic University. John is a prolific writer, having written 20 books on theology, evolution, Darwin, science and religion, and new atheism, and Teilhard de Chardin, among other things. And some of his books have been translated into as many as 6 languages. He has a new book coming out this year, which is getting great advance notices, called Resting on the Future, Catholic Theology for an Unfinished Universe. Do you have a publication date yet? August. Look for that on Amazon. He lectures internationally on many issues related to science and religion. In 2002, he was the winner of the Owen Garrigan Award in Science and Religion. In 2004, the Sophia Award for Theological Excellence. And in 2008, a Friend of Darwin Award from the National Center for Science Education. That probably made you some enemies as well. He testified, this is the one I like the best though, he testified for the plaintiffs in the Harrisburg, Pennsylvania trial, Intelligent Design Trial. Kitzmiller versus Dover Board of Education. Kathleen Duffy is a sister of St. Joseph, is a professor of physics at Chestnut Hill College in Philadelphia, where she directs the Interdisciplinary Honors Program in the Institute for Science and Religion. She is editor of Teilhard Studies and serves on the advisory board of the American Teilhard Association and also of Cosmos and Creation. Her present research deals with the way Teilhard de Chardin's religious writings connect with modern science. She's published several book chapters and articles on these topics and edited a volume of essays entitled Rediscovering Teilhard's Fire. And she wrote a book of her own, Teilhard's Mysticism, Seeing the Interface of Evolution. John Grimm, president of the American Teilhard Association. Do you have brochures here?
They're in the back. Please speak with me later if you'd like to know more about it.
Please look into the American Teilhard Association if you are interested. He's co-director with Mary Evelyn Tucker, who's also his wife, on the Forum of Religion and Ecology at Yale. He's a senior lecturer in School of Forestry and Environmental Studies at the Yale Divinity School, Yale University, where he's also a research scholar. You're a specialist, if I'm not mistaken, in Native American culture and religion.
That's right.
Does that include indigenous religions around the world?
The term indigenous is often used to talk about Native people.
Okay. And also in comparative world religions. He's got a Ph.D. From Fordham University. He's the executive producer, along with Mary Evelyn Tucker, of the award-winning and extremely well-received hour-long documentary Journey of the Universe.
It's on Netflix. You can find it very easily.
His books, which are all co-authored with Mary Evelyn Tucker, include Ecology and Religion, a 10-volume series on religions of the world and ecology, among others. All of these people have written more books than we can possibly talk about up here. Go to Amazon, Google them, you'll find them and be pleased. And they have several books in the pipeline, including a biography of Thomas Berry. Ilia Delio is a Franciscan sister of Washington, D.C., and director of the Haught Catholic Studies program here at Georgetown University, where she's also a visiting professor. She's, prior to being in charge of Catholic Studies, she was a senior research fellow at Woodstock Theological Center in the area of science and religion, focusing on transhumanism, evolution, and emergent Christianity. She holds a doctorate in pharmacology from Rutgers Graduate School of Biomedical Sciences, and a doctorate in historical theology from Fordham. Like all of our panelists, she's a prolific writer, author of 16 books and many articles. A couple of the most recent books are The Unbearable Wholeness of Being, God, Evolution, and the Power of Love, and From Teilhard to Omega, which has won several awards. Should we actually get going? Not quite yet. I want to start with a prayer. And the reason I want to start with a prayer in particular is because the prayer is taken from People's Companion to the Breviary, published by the Carmelites of Indianapolis. It's taken from the liturgy of Teilhard de Chardin for April 10th. And isn't it ironic that here in the Catholic milieu, we have no feast of Teilhard de Chardin, but if you want to walk up or go up the street to the National Cathedral tomorrow morning, you can participate in the liturgy of Teilhard de Chardin, who is in their liturgy. We give you thanks, Creator God, for your servant Teilhard, and for all those who help us to see you in your universe. May creation be continually transformed, that all may share in the life, death, and resurrection of God become human, our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. So, a couple of years ago, Mary and I went to pitch our television documentary to PBS. They'd never heard of Teilhard de Chardin. They thought he had an interesting story, but they had an important question. Is there an audience for this? From what we told them, isn't he outdated? Is there any relevance? Does he continue to have any relevance? And that's what we're here to talk about with these four extremely knowledgeable people. They were all very gracious when I asked them to each take just a little tiny corner of Teilhard to introduce the discussion here. And so they're going to try to do the impossible. They're going to try to limit their presentations to 5 minutes each. You'll be sympathetic if... I may not be sympathetic, but they'll be sympathetic. You'll be sympathetic if they're forced to go over. Jack, you accepted the kind of the baseline responsibility of talking about Teilhard's God.
Thank you, Frank. I'm especially grateful to you and the university for organizing this conference, and to all of you, whether for your expertise or interest in Teilhard. I personally think nothing is more important than keeping alive the memory of this man and of his thought. Well, I've been asked to say a few words about what he meant by God. He asked in one of his essays one time, who at last will give us a God for evolution? Well, it turned out that nobody came closer to doing so than Teilhard himself. He wants to remind us that over the past 200 years, science has shown that without a doubt, the universe we live in is still coming into being. Geology, biology, and now more recently cosmology have demonstrated undeniably that we live in an unfinished universe. And he says that people, Christian people and theologians have to develop as a habit of thought this awareness that we live in a universe that's still becoming new, that's still coming into being every day. And what that means, especially for the idea of God, is that we need to think of God no longer so much as the efficient cause or the governor of the universe as its goal. God is the goal of evolution. This is pretty well known to most followers of Teilhard, but what might not be so well known is the arduous process that he went through as a person to arrive at that understanding of God. I think we have to begin by recalling that for Teilhard, a lifelong preoccupation was his sensitivity, we might say his hypersensitivity, to the fact of his own perishing. He talks about how, when he was still a very young child, he wept when he saw locks of his hair going up in flames, and how he followed this up by trying to tie his life as closely as possible to what is indestructible. So he sought out rocks and pieces of iron, and we might conjecture that even his choice of a career in geology, which deals with hard, fixed objects, has something to do with his longing to tie his perishable life to something that lasts. So his life turns out, I think, to be best understood in many ways. Also his thought is best understood as an ongoing search for what he called consistence, by which he meant something solid, foundational, something indestructible that he could connect his life to and that would somehow address his anxieties about perishing, and also that would set the universe, this ongoing, unfinished, perishable universe, on a firm foundation as well. Whatever could provide this consistence, that would be his God. And this explains why this is puzzling to a lot of us, perhaps, that even as a young man, as a young priest, as a young scientist, he freely admits his attraction to metaphysical materialism, to the philosophy that matter is all there is. After all, what could be more consistent, what could be more indestructible and durable than this realm of lifeless and mindless matter, out of which life and mind showed up for a day or two in cosmic time, and then, as scientists tell us, will eventually sink back in to the sphere of mindlessness, this eternal matter. He felt almost a mystical attraction to this, and he understood, and if you're here today, he would still understand why so many scientifically educated people are attracted to materialism. He thinks there's almost a mystical allure of this body of material, lifeless and mindless stuff to a certain kind of personality, particularly his own, which was a rather melancholic personality, which he freely admits likes to live more in the past in a way than in the future, which is quite ironic. And it's also ironic that it was science itself that eventually proved to him that materialism does not work as far as providing a refuge from perishability is concerned. What science does, especially today, is look back. It digs back into the cosmic past as far as it can go. But what it finds there is not something solid or coherent or intelligible. It finds incoherence, scattered fragmentary bits of matter. This, in other words, this is a universe which, if you take it back to its past, dissolves into fluff, into sand. So, to make a long story short, and I only have 5 minutes, have I used most of it up already?
You've used just 5 minutes. I'll give you 2 more.
Okay, I'll give you 2 more. To find the consistency, what he had to do is, after he arrived at this fragmentary, incoherent past, and he wants us to do this, to turn around and look toward the future. If you follow the path of evolution as it moves from billions of years ago toward now and then into the future, what you will see is these fragments coming together into more and more elaborate, tight, coherent states of being. And so intelligibility can be found, therefore, only by looking toward what happens in the future. Right now, we live in an unfinished universe which is, for the most part, still unintelligible to us. And that includes the idea of God. But if we're going to get a glimpse of God in any way, we have to look toward where the universe is converging, toward more unity and compactness and complexity and consciousness in the future. So ultimately, the consistence that he's looking for is the result of the pull of the future. And God is the ultimate future on the cosmos. And if this pull were relaxed or slackened only for a moment, the whole mass would fall back into multiplicity. So look for God as the God of evolution's future.
I did you a favor. You really compacted everything into 5 minutes. The reason we chose this style of going short appetizers before the main discussion is because there are so many different facets of Teilhard. So what John just did could be an hour's lecture, and it's been an hour's lecture in the past. Now we go to another appetizer. It's another aspect of Teilhard is that for popular understanding of Teilhard, if you go to social media and the internet, you'll discover it's all about love. So why not talk about that?
Thank you. Thank you, Frank. It's a great joy and privilege to be here with all of you today celebrating Teilhard. And as Jack did, I would like to thank the organizers, especially Frank, for putting all of this together. A lot, and Mary too, I guess I should say, because the two of them really did a wonderful job. Well, in 5 minutes, I am going to tell you everything Teilhard and I know about love. So hang on. According to Teilhard, love is the most universal, formidable, and mysterious of cosmic energies. The fundamental impulse of life, the bloodstream of evolution. Its aim is the great work of union, of communion, of oneness. Those who fall in love embark on an adventure. They develop a relationship that, like evolution, will survive only by embracing the life of perpetual discovery and by finding ways to surmount the obstacles to greater growth. At an early age, Teilhard fell in love with rock and with the beauty of Earth's landscape, as Jack has just told us. But later in life, he came to know the power of interpersonal love. And I think this is where he was able to also, besides, understanding about evolution, it was another way in which he began to understand the power of spirit. But with his understanding of evolution, he was able to integrate these experiences, the beauty and the love he had for Earth, the love he had for other persons, and his understanding of this marvelous process of evolution into an expansive cosmic vision of love. For Teilhard, love's roots are cosmic. Its presence spans the entire epic of evolution. In the early universe, love was overshadowed by its predecessors, the forces that were fusing hydrogen into helium, creating atoms from nuclei and electrons, and gathering the gas and dust scattered throughout the early universe into galaxies and stars. With the coming of life, the energy of love surfaced gradually as a more spiritual form of attraction, always urging the cosmos toward a single goal, the omega point, the future, which he later recognized as the cosmic Christ. A thrust toward unity is coded into the very fabric of the cosmos, encouraging what Teilhard calls creative union, a term that implies a unioning love that differentiates, meaning that whenever two really actually become one, each becomes richer and the pair is capable of more. This principle holds true for all sorts of unions, though Teilhard was anxious that we apply it to the noosphere, that collective thinking layer surrounding Earth's biosphere that, like any living body, needs a heart and a soul. The internet gives a sense of the power available when this interconnected global sphere of human consciousness shares thoughts and ideas. However, to this day, the noosphere lacks a common passion and a sense of solidarity, as we know as we watch the news at night and watch all of the terror and the wars that are pervading our earth. It has not yet learned how to release the formidable energy that lies dormant beneath the turbulent power of love. Love alone can provide the affinity and integration among the peoples of the world that is needed to overcome the animosities that drive us apart. If we do not learn to love, Teilhard says, we will perish. The situation is critical. And the only way forward, he says, is in the direction of a common passion. For Teilhard, it's not enough that we survive. Instead, he envisions a day when humanity will reach a higher form of life together, a day when we will become more deeply conscious, more fully alive, and truly creative. For the world to truly flourish, our love must extend around the globe to all persons of whatever persuasion. It must extend to our earth, to our ancestors who have brought us to this moment, and to our children of the future. True love demands plunging headlong into life. But how can we dare to stretch out our arms to embrace the whole world so that we can together call down the fire? In order to find inspiration for this venture, Teilhard points to the great religions as a deep source of spiritual wisdom. Only a dynamic spirituality oriented toward the future can keep us animated, strengthened, and filled with zest for life, capable of sustaining interest in this worthwhile but difficult task. Because he found that he could not love a collective, Teilhard realized that love energy must be personal. Thus he imaged the urge toward union embedded in the cosmos as a divine presence, not unlike Sophia, the wisdom figure of the scriptures, although he imaged Sophia as love. This eternal feminine presence became for him the face and the heart of a God that he could love, a God large enough to embrace the world, one who could expect from him in return self-transcendence and self-sacrificing love. As the bond that holds together the foundations of the universe, the one who bestirred the original mass of matter and energy, Sophia now plays over the surface of the divine fire, continuing to allure us into a future, to gather us together and to lead us to the cosmic Christ, in whom we will realize that we are already one. During the discussion following these short presentations, we will address our present global situation more specifically and consider whether Teilhard's vision is at all practical or even possible. Whether or not we agree with him, Teilhard remains totally optimistic. He knows that the day will come when, after harnessing the ether, the winds, the tides, and gravitation, we will harness for God the energies of love. And on that day, for the second time in the history of the world, humanity will have discovered fire. Thank you.
John Grimm has accepted the responsibility for connecting the dots between Teilhard's thinking and the robust ecological movement that he himself is part of.
Thanks, Frank. Thank you very much for putting this together. Mary, your work and emails are so helpful. Appreciate it very much. And to Georgetown University for sponsoring this event. As we were speaking earlier, it's so rare when we come together, the Teilhard family, the Teilhard community. It's very special. I want to invite all of you May 16th. Do I have the date right, Jack? I think May 16th is the annual meeting of the American Teilhard Association at Union Theological Seminary in New York. And this year we're also focused on the 60th anniversary of Teilhard's death. And Jack will deliver that address. Particularly, the invitation was particularly given to Jack because of his expertise in this area. I work with Kathy Duffy in the American Teilhard Association. So it's an active organization, small, but we managed to get some work done and to raise the question of Teilhard's relevance. I wanted to remember some people first off. Thomas King has been mentioned, Jim Salmon, Malvina Hoffman, Thomas Berry, Ewart Cousins, all of these people associated with Teilhard's thought and helped to bring it forward and to develop it. So Teilhard's relevance, interestingly, is not just dependent upon Teilhard himself. I think that's what we're feeling in relation to you also. His thought is brought forward by all of us, and we're beginning to explore it in new ways. For example, if you take theology, science, and ecology, which is where I'm headed in my remarks. Teilhard was much criticized in all three. I've been critical of Teilhard from the ecological standpoint, so I'll go in that direction. Theologically, consider Jack's remark about this sense of God in a traditional Christian community, Roman Catholic community, his idea of connecting God with evolution at a time when the church was not capable of accepting evolution at that time. Very problematic for him. So you can see where he's really moving at the knife's edge. 1881 to 1955, his birth and death dates. It's a time of great ferment of thought, and certainly theological thought. He ran headlong into a great deal of opposition. He didn't have a community that he could speak with about his thought and really help develop it. So he had a science community, didn't he? And he was a recognized scientist. In fact, his science work was published during his life. The speculative, philosophical, metaphysical, theological thought was not. It wasn't published until after his death. And there are reasons for that, but I only have 5 minutes. In the science community, though, you would expect that science received Teilhard then and his speculative thought warmly. Not at all. Teilhard was committed to materialism, but his materialism was shot through and through with the spirit. Matter and spirit for Teilhard were two dimensions of the same thing. So Jack's comment earlier about spirit drawing matter forward, if that spirit did not draw matter forward, it would collapse. That was the role of matter was guided by gravity, and spirit, the Christic, is what drew towards the future. So this is where Jack's work has been so helpful for all of us in understanding the Christic, the sense of future. And Jack, when he talks about promise, ties it into the biblical world. Really beautifully done. But theology, the controversy, science, the controversy. Teilhard has a teleological vision. He has a sense of a drive within this material process. Totally unacceptable in the science community. So he had good working relationships with the geologists that he worked with, but his deep depth dimension thought did not move into the science community in the same way. How about ecology? Think of his dates again, 1881 to 1955. What are the driving philosophical, what's his worldview? This is French philosophical emphasis on progress. The world is constantly becoming better, and evolution supports that. And Teilhard is totally in that camp. evolution is bringing us ever fuller towards human consciousness, our emergence in the evolutionary process. So Teilhard will use the term hominization to talk about the evolutionary process which has come through the emergence of the universe into the galaxies, our galaxy, the Earth, the solar system Earth, into the spirit of the Earth and forming the human. So we are like a culminating drive in the evolutionary process. Is that French philosophical? Is that Western philosophical thinking? Humanities. Teilhard is a humanist. Where are all the creatures in Teilhard's thought? Where's the Earth community? Now, some people will make an argument that Teilhard was an ecologist. Well, that's obviously he's not. He's a trained geologist. Ecology is a specific science, how the relationship of organisms in an ecosystem or a biosphere. It wasn't his specialty. Did he have a sense of the creatures of the world itself? Definitely. He has a profound aesthetic vision. He has a profound appreciative vision because this is the world which has given rise to evolutionary processes which have led to the human. But Teilhard has a sense of once the spirit has moved through a stage or an element, it's no longer in that spirit. So my studies with American Indian peoples, indigenous peoples, Teilhard would say early humans, indigenous peoples, the spirit of the earth was in them, and then it moved into the civilizational realm. So native people, in a sense, fell back. He equivocates on this, but the same with the earth community writ large, seals to giraffes to insects. For Teilhard, they were instrumental in the formation of the human, but he failed to see the role that they played in our bodies, the formation of our bodies, in our minds. We come out of the Cenozoic period. Our brilliance of our minds comes out of this brilliant world. So the point I'm trying to make is if you diminish this world, you diminish the whole human capacity of creative thought as it goes forward. So is Teilhard relevant in this regard? Definitely. Definitely. And his relevance is we extend his thought. We think through him. Instead of pedestaling Teilhard, such a beautiful bronze, and Teilhard would not want to be pedestaled that way. He would want people to use his thought and work with his thought, go forward with his thought. So how do we go forward with his thought? Let's consider this, and I'm getting close.
We can consider this as we...
Teilhard has one of the issues that brought him into question and trouble in his early work was his turn from Genesis, his turn from creation in the past. So again, the comments that have made this lovely comments about love pulling us forward, the creative process for Teilhard is not back then, it's right now. Cosmogenesis. So this world is involved in creative evolutionary activity. And for Teilhard then to extend his thought, to begin to realize the ecological thought, that we are totally interrelated, and that this community of life that we depend upon, we now begin to realize we have shut it down extensively. As we revisit that thought, we begin to realize the creative possibilities that Teilhard lays out in cosmogenesis, that this world around us is an interdependent world, and we recover again a depth dimension of ourselves in relationship to the earth community. So Teilhard doesn't have an ecological component exactly, but by extension, he gives rise to an even more profound ecological insight.
Well, not bad for 10 minutes. That will deserve much more discussion as we discuss it as a group. And finally, Sister Ilia Delio, Teilhard's vision was that evolution has not finished and the human species is not finished, right?
Right. So again, I want to thank Frank and Mary for organizing this great event today. And I want to pick up, John, where you left off on ecology, because I think that's a great starting point for talking about Teilhard and technology, because sometimes I think we can think of ecology as just sort of a warm, happy, interconnected, lovely human family, Earth human family. But we are moving, and I think that's what Teilhard, tried to bring into our central focus, that we are, as Jack pointed out initially, in an evolutionary cosmos. And so he really devoted his life. He was, again, a trained scientist, a paleontologist, but deeply Ignatian. So he tried to bring together evolution and Christianity, not just the sacred and the secular, but really God at the heart of this evolutionary cosmos. One thing about Teilhard is that he saw that evolution is the rise of consciousness, not just matter coming into formation, but consciousness itself is rising and complexifying. So he saw the human person as the arrow of evolution. We're not just byproducts of evolution, we are evolution, now become conscious of itself. But as he looked around, at Earth community, he realized that we seem to be, and we feel this today, sometimes up against the wall. We hear of these endless conflicts, endless wars. It seems that we're in different impasses. Are we up against the big evolutionary wall? And Teilhard said, well, we have maxed out the expanding phase of evolution, and now we are at a critical phase. We either must converge and unify, or we will annihilate. And so he saw the next phase of evolution as this converging phase or unification phase. And in his words, he says, the success of humanity's evolution will not be determined by survival of the fittest, but by our capacity to converge and unify. So when he discovered the computer, he was like, I think of a kid in a candy shop. He was like, wow, this is the greatest thing, I have seen in a long time, since the French mountains, I guess. And he was just enamored by the power of modern technology. He was enamored by the cyclotron, the power of energy. But he saw with the computer that we could, in a sense, enter into a new level of consciousness. And therefore, in a sense, we have already now emerged into this new level with the internet. But in Teilhard's time, we're talking the early 50s, he saw that the internet, the computer, would usher in the next level of evolution, or what he called the noosphere, the level of shared mind or shared consciousness. For Teilhard, then, this continues evolution. In other words, evolution now from the Big Bang onward is not only in biological evolution, but now we are in, you might say, noological evolution. In other words, we are to harness, he said, our energies through a shared consciousness for the next stage of humanity and for the Earth itself. You might say what he called the ultra-human. He did foresee, and I find Teilhard very prophetic in his insights on computer technology. For one thing, he thought that computers would complete our brains by instantaneous retrieval of information. Well, I don't know about you, but it certainly completes my brain most of the time. Second, he thought that the computer would improve our brains by faster speeds, processing information more rapidly. He was a prophetic figure, there's no doubt about it, and he was a mystic, I think, of some sorts. He could see more deeply than what most people would see in that time. But he also saw that technology was not just about speed and making things easier for us. Technology, he thought, was about harnessing the spiritual energies. So what he saw is that through the internet, we would be, in a sense, more collaborative, a new level of consciousness. But this new level of consciousness is not about more information. It's about a deepening of mind and heart. And in that sense, I think Teilhard saw that science is not the end. We're not about just improving ourselves. So we would be, smarter and live longer and live happier. But he said science in the end must, in a sense, aid the deepening of spirituality. So he did, at one point, he places spirituality, in a sense, in the forefront of science. In other words, science is not its own limit. And therefore, technology is then Within the context of evolution, it plays the role of convergence. Technology is to converge us, not just occupy us. Technology is to form a collective mind, not just a multiplicity of minds. And through technology, he saw the next stage of humanity as what he called ultra-humanism. So in a sense, we are on that next stage of evolution towards ultra-humanity, but I'm not sure we have reflected as much as Teilhard did on where technology can lead us in this next stage of ultra-humanism. He thought that a shared consciousness, the level of noogenesis, could usher in a new type of interthinking human with new possibilities for evolving life on the planet. So in terms of ecology, it wasn't, I think, he would see technology, in a sense, advancing the ecological interconnectivity. So that technology placed in the context of evolution is that through technology, we move to more being, more consciousness, a deepening of love, a deepening of heart and mind. And in that new collective consciousness, he thought that we, in a sense, could rise to a new level of heart, a new soul, perhaps even the world soul, you might say, retrieved through the computer. So Teilhard is and was, and I think he's still alive in this room in some ways, a very insightful and one step ahead of the game type of thinker. He also saw that with technology and the noosphere, with this deepening of love, the deepening of mind, he saw then the emergence of Christ. In other words, the technology can link us and link world religions, help us converge to harness these spiritual energies that Kathy mentioned at the end. For the forward movement, not of just humankind, but of the whole Earth community, what he called planetization, moving towards this globalized mind, a globalized heart for the rise of the Christ or the cosmic person. I think that's it.
In the combination of 4 brief presentations, you've got a phenomenal collection of insights into Teilhard. I'm still trying to figure out if everything you've all said is relevant, though. No, since we're working on this documentary, we now filter everything we read through what would Teilhard think. We read about climate change and the conflict about that. We read about artificial intelligence and nanotechnology and medical advances and Ray Kurzweil and the singularity, and DNA modification, atheism and science, creationism, theme parks, the meaning of sin and redemption. We didn't have time to get somebody on a panel to talk about Teilhard and feminism, but there's something to be said there as well. So the basic question then is, can we connect dotted lines to things that we're reading about in today's paper with what Teilhard had to say? I think you did some of that definitely in what you were just saying, Ilia. As a stimulant to talking about that, let me just say that, read you this. Ross Douthat recently wrote in the New York Times, "One of the anxieties haunting the 21st century is a fear that technological change will soon make human lives seem essentially superfluous. Soon, if not tomorrow, the rich may be able to re-engineer bodies and minds, making human equality seem like a quaint conceit. Work is disappearing for the erstwhile middle class, the rich are increasingly self-segregating and marrying among themselves, and virtual realities are replacing older forms of intimacy." How would Teilhard react to that, to what he wrote? Jack?
Well, I think just to unify what Kathy said with what Ilia said, there is the possibility that all this could get out of whack and go haywire. But whenever the universe has become more at every stage in the past, This has only happened because of the intercommunion of entities, whether these be atoms or molecules or whatever. But for that intercommunion to take place, there had to be a center that organized these elements into something new. So if we want to extend that to the prospect of the Earth becoming more, as Ilia said today, we would have to ask whether there is some sort of center that can bring all of this together. And since the elements that are being brought together are persons, this center has to be at least personal itself, because we cannot be fully attracted to something that's less than personal. It has to be concrete. It has to be available in our history. And it has to be something that can lift up the mass. So we have to ask the question, and this is a question for religion and theology and for theology and science, is there anything that could do something parallel at the present stage of cosmic evolution to what, say, the nucleus of the atom did to pre-atomic elements, or the nucleus of the eukaryotic cell to organize the entities into something new. At each stage there's a convergence, then there's an emergence, but in order for that leap to take place, something of the transcendent has to enter into our history. So this is the question that I would ask Ilia and Kathy. Is there anything available to us that would unify the mass? Teilhard also talked about how we need a great hope held in common for this new stage to come about. And I'm with your columnist from the New York Times. It's very difficult for me to see anything like that happening right now. But I think the task of all of us is to look for whether there is.
I was just thinking that, in the early universe, it was a force that really was available. The forces became available as the universe cooled down. Gravity wasn't able to bring the gas and dust together until it was cool enough. And fusion could happen only at a certain temperatures and pressures, and then that force. Now, what is the force today? And you would say the force of, the omega point or the future, but I'm not really sure with that, what it is, but it is a good question. And
I do think that there's a lot of heightened fear with some of the new technologies today, because in some ways, they're operating out of an old cosmology, sort of a Newtonian framework. And I think when you operate out of a Newtonian framework, it's going to be this or that, rich or poor. One's going to win, one's going to lose. Teilhard thinks in evolutionary framework, a cosmic framework. He thinks of a deep interconnectedness. He also sees that matter is porous, it's open to spirit. So I don't think he would look at the emerging technologies today fearfully. He would, in a sense, ask, how are these harnessing the energies of love? How are these, you might say, unifying us? And I do think today we're developing technologies so quickly. In a sense, you could say the unreflected cyber life may not be worth living. That if we're developing them so quickly without reflecting, where are we going with them? What are we creating them for? I think Teilhard was one who was always very reflective about even scientific achievements, or about what he would, in a sense, discover with the new technologies. The technologies in themselves can be for good or for ill. We're creating them. So what we do find, and I think what Teilhard noticed, we have the capacity to transcend ourselves. We are creatures in evolution. We are, in a sense, the arrow of evolution. So the very things we are creating, we are transcending ourselves by our own creativities. The question is toward what, and for what purpose?
And just one small thought. I do think that today, in the past we might have thought, what great leader can be the center. But I think today what we need is a collective body of, a movement that will move us on, that will be attractive. And I don't know what that is yet, but I think that, some of these movements about heightened consciousness, there's a lot of that going on. They're reaching out to do that. So
The term that Teilhard used was co-reflection, that we're not just now self-reflecting. I don't go in my own little room and reflect by myself what's going to happen to me if I become, a cyborg or a robot or something. But we reflect together because, what he's saying is now with the emergence of technology, we have a greater capacity to join minds, to think together, to, in a sense, deepen together what we want. And I do think we're living between we're living between cosmologies, so we're not really in Teilhard's world yet.
I agree.
Have we,
Go ahead.
have we outgrown, Teilhard was criticized even in his lifetime, not his lifetime, but he was criticized shortly after he died when his books came out, about not being sufficiently scientific. And a criticism in the 80s and 90s was that his thought didn't really take into account science. And science has progressed so rapidly and become so extreme. Has science totally outrun Teilhard? I mean, is he becoming irrelevant in that sense?
Well, I think you have to distinguish between the hundreds of papers that Teilhard wrote in a purely scientific vein, about which there is no controversy. In fact, the papers made him one of the top 2 or 3 geologists of the Asian continent. So this man knew what science was. What he's doing in the phenomenon and most of the popular essays that have made him controversial is working pretty much alone to try to synthesize what he's learned about through scientific discovery, more than with scientific method, what scientific discoveries tell us about the nature of ultimate reality. And when he writes these papers, he's seen as controversial. Partly it's his own fault, because when he wrote The Phenomenon of Man, or the human phenomenon, in the early pages of that work, he said, what I'm presenting here is nothing that goes beyond what science can confirm. But he was using science there in a very broad sense. What he was really looking for was to be actually more radically empirical than conventional science is. Conventional science leaves out so much that's really there, especially our own subjectivity and so many other things that are qualitative and value-laden that are going on in the world. That science, by definition, quite rightly, has abstracted from values, meaning, subjectivity, purpose, God, and talked only about physical causation. Teilhard knew this, because when he wrote his papers, he didn't bring God, value, and so forth into it. But when he wrote The Phenomenon, he was doing something different. But it's not against the spirit of science. It was to actually expand the empirical orientation of science to take into account things that science unfortunately leaves out, like consciousness, for example, which today in a materialist worldview doesn't even exist. And yet it's the most palpable experience that any of us has. So if you try to construct a worldview that leaves out something so vital and important as mind and subjectivity, then that's unempirical. That's irrelevant. What we need is a radically empirical approach to the world that includes within what he calls hyperphysics, the experience of consciousness, and also the experiences of faith. Religions, you ask about his relevance. When you're asking about his relevance, you're asking about whether his paying attention to faith and religion is relevant. Well, for him, in this wider worldview, religion and faith are the way in which the universe, now that it has become conscious of itself, continues that search for the center, which has been going on from the start. And that's why the religious search is vitally relevant to being radically empirical in understanding what kind of universe we live in.
I find it very attractive the way he uses science poetically, actually. I mean, I think for me, that's always what attracted me to his writings. Even before I was a scientist, I think that almost attracted me to science. But so I think that's one thing that's really good. But the other thing is I've noticed, thinking about, I'm interested in chaos theory, complexity theory, some of these new theories that are coming out in science, and his writings point in that direction. You know, he was looking at the universe in such a different way from, you know, from his fellow scientists, that I think he could see what was happening. And now the theories are coming out, and you can see that he was at least alluding to them. And I find that very exciting and like to make those connections.
Just following up, one thing about Teilhard is he kept detailed journals of his scientific data. I mean, the records are that he was very precise in his measurements and very detailed about keeping, you know, accumulating the data. And so he really was a bona fide scientist in this way. But it wasn't about data collection alone. I think one thing that Father Tom King, you know, in his book Mysticism, Teilhard's Mysticism of Knowing, thinking was really essential. So it's not just data collection, it's how do you think about these observations, this data? How do you make sense of it? How does it unify? How does it deepen our insight? And I think he brings that, maybe it was the Jesuit training in him, you know, that you know, many years of scholastic studies probably instilled in him a rigor of thinking and reflecting. But he does have that unique combination of a deep spirituality with a precise observation of the things of nature. And I think one thing that Teilhard speaks to me about is the importance of an interior life, of spirituality, even as we scientifically engage the world. You know, Jack has mentioned about, you know, the materialism, you know, that matter is its own explanation. And what Teilhard sees is that there's a depth to being itself, a depth to everything that exists, even though he was a very detailed-oriented paleontologist. So he's a very unique blend, I think, of scientist, priest, and prophet.
And his relevance then becomes very interesting in terms of that interiority. At Yale, two of the issues that students are very active about, in fact, I believe today there's a sit-in going on at the president's office at Yale, and over divestment, and so the effort to convince a establishment which has a significant endowment to pull it out of fossil fuels. And the other is food, especially factory farming of food, the treatment of animals as if they were simply machines that could be manipulated, slaughtered, and raised up in what some might call an inhumane way. They're not allowed to live a fullness of their life. So what does that have to do with Teilhard? If you consider the interiority of all reality, and Teilhard will explore this issue in terms of these axes of openings. How does the world speak to us? It speaks to us in the infinitely large and the infinitely small. I mean, we don't even know how to think about quantum thought yet in all this. But he says it also speaks to us in the infinitely complex, complexity consciousness. And so we've developed some really interesting remarks here about that consciousness in the human. And Teilhard sees that consciousness in the human as extending into the universe. So, Teilhard, you mean to say that stones, that the matter in the galaxies has consciousness? And for Teilhard, definitely yes. It's not human consciousness. It's its own organizational patterning, its own consciousness. But it's an interiority which is crucial. And I think students now are understanding the interiority of animals, the interiority of life. We diminish that, we diminish ourselves. We have problems with ourselves because we have problems with the earth, the way we treat the earth too. So this interiority, the relevance of Teilhard's thought, it speaks to these students.
Good point. So the consciousness seems to be the element that Teilhard introduced, which in some sense, science is now catching up with.
Yeah,
Maybe.
maybe. Yeah, within neuroscience, I mean, there's a lot of neuroscience research, but some scientists are going to say, you know, that's all there is the matter, you know. And so that's what I meant by maybe.
Before I go on to another question, I just want to make sure I'm not misunderstanding, did I hear from the three of you in the discussion earlier that we seem to be on the cusp of a new emergence?
Hopefully.
It's a cosmogenesis.
Is that right?
Well, in evolution, in cosmology, emergence takes many, many millions of years sometimes. And what Teilhard asks in one of his essays in The Future of Man is, consider what the Earth, which is metonymy for nature, for the universe, will be like, psychically speaking, 1 million years from now. And that's not very long in evolutionary times. So it's very difficult for us to say, whether we're on the cusp of it and how long that's going to be.
I just want you all
looking around at
know
television.
what happened when you wake up tomorrow and we're a new...
There's also room for setbacks and regressive movements in this. If the universe is a drama, and drama, unlike a machine, allows for lots of different dead ends and only occasional and seldom, occasionally and seldom does it make these leaps.
And newness comes out of, what do you call it? Some kind of crisis. I think you don't get, if we're in equilibrium, which is what we usually all want to be in, nothing happens. So you really do need something dramatic to happen in order to create. And I think of some examples like a volcano is terrible, right? The poor people at the bottom of the volcano their homes get destroyed. Maybe they haven't had time to get away, and it's a tragedy. But what happens, 20 years later is you have fertile soil. So, and I also think about the difficulties we're having now with the Middle East and understanding that culture. For one thing, with technology, the television is making us aware of these countries the way, we've never been aware before. And I think whenever you bring, differences together, for instance, I always think in protons, but the protons don't want to get together either. And it's only when they get beyond a certain barrier that the other force, the strong force, is able to bring them together and they become something new. So I think we need to work these things out, and it's going to take a long time, but it's not a sign, I don't think, that things are getting worse, which most people are saying. It's a sign that we're moving into a new era, and we have new problems, and we need to, to deal with them in a way, and it shouldn't be a surprise to us that we have these difficulties, I think.
So are you talking about proton protest?
I just lost my train of thought there. That was
I
very
just want to pick up, though, and say that what you're saying, Kathy, is that's right. Teilhard would say that while it looks to us, on the outer level, that it's all in chaos, it's all falling apart. And you hear people talking about this, is the end of the world coming? It just seems like endless destruction. And again, it looks like the big brick wall. There's nowhere to go. And Teilhard is saying, no, not pessimism. Look on the other side. We're being summoned to something more. It's always, do you look at the glass half full or half empty, right? It's always a matter of seeing. And seeing was important to Teilhard, right? He said, there's nothing profane here below for those who know how to see. Out of what center do we see this world and the things of this world? He did see there's a pattern going on. If you look over cosmic evolution, the very broad pattern of convergence, what I think Jack and Kathy mentioned, convergence, complexity, and the rise of consciousness. So he's saying that there's something more going on in evolution than meets the physical eye. And the person who is in touch with the more, you might say, is the one who can help lead then us into the next level of evolution. He sees this whole thing as the rise of the Christ, Christification or Christogenesis or cosmic personalization, to use his language.
You've all touched on this, but not explicitly. Teilhard's notion that defines our condition is self-reflective consciousness, which is what gives us freedom, gives us the capacity to love, right? And it also gives us a capacity to screw up evolution or to enhance evolution. People talk about co-creating evolution. Do you want to talk about that?
Co-creating? Me?
If you look at human history, in terms of thousands of years, it's not hard to become very discouraged about whether we're making progress. And for him, progress doesn't mean anything crude or economic. It means the intensification of complexity, consciousness. And that requires some center around which everything can occur. But if you look at the question of are we getting anywhere in terms of cosmic evolution, then this virtue is not always talked about when we think of Teilhard. Patience. He made a lot of how patience is absolutely necessary if you're going to have a wide and long view of things. And seeds can lie dormant in the soil through a long, long winter. And it seems from their point of view, nothing is going to happen. But then all of a sudden, if you know cosmic evolution, these crises, as Kathy was talking about, occur. And then things which had been purely divergent begin to converge. And convergence it can turn into tighter associations and integration. And out of that, we've seen it time and time again in cosmic history, something emergent can come about. This is why knowing evolution is a very good way of learning patience, and if not despairing. In the intellectual world today, which is dominated by scientific naturalism and materialism and cosmic pessimism, it seems that the most realistic attitude, the most relevant attitude people can take is one of discouragement and perhaps even despair, and work out on our own personal lives some sort of meaning. But evolution should give us a much wider and more hopeful vision of possibilities.
It's interesting also when we try to see evolution, it becomes unavailable to us because we are encased in it. I think another example is climate change. You hear this constant pitter-patter of, well, there's this storm caused by climate change, and we can't see it. It's a hyper-object, to cite the work of Timothy Morton, who's a philosopher who tries to think through some of these issues, an object which encompasses so completely that we're not able to put our minds around it. And yet, at some point, we have insight into these capacities. We have capacities for insight into these hyperobjects, and I think one that I see on the horizon in relationship, say, to the despair we feel with regard to evolution and the despair we feel with regard to climate change, the inability of the nation state to really move ahead on these issues and to foreground a cap-and-trade policy that would really be on the ground and bring to bear mechanics that are already available. The taxation process is already laid out with corporations, and why can't we move in this regard? And so the depression or the pessimism that emerges, I think Teilhard provides us a way of seeing again those entry points. Why is it that this Pope will release an encyclical this summer and it will address climate change and environmental issues? What is it that he's seeing? Will there be a Teilhardian component to this encyclical? I'm very interested to see that because I take it also as a signal or a sign of this larger issue is suddenly emerging in front of us, new ways of thinking about it.
I should be turning to the audience for questions, but I have a specific question that I really would like to get your reaction to. Teilhard was criticized in his time for not dealing with the question of evil. Why does God do bad things to good people, or is that what it is? But Frontline recently did a documentary on the way doctors deal with their patients, and it emphasized the kind of a failure in medical services because doctors have come to think of death as a failure. If somebody dies, they fail, and it leads to, along with other technological reasons, to extreme efforts to keep people alive. How did Teilhard feel about death? Jack?
Well, at one point he says that God finds both suffering and death odious. So the question then is, why would God make a universe in which evil and suffering can come about? Teilhard doesn't have any final answers to these questions, but he does say this: from now on, this goes back to what I said at the beginning, we have to make a habit of mind of remembering that we live in a universe that's still coming into being. The universe is unfinished. And logically speaking, any process which has not yet reached its ideal end is, prior to that end, liable to have an element of darkness to it. And within that darkness of an unfinished universe, evil can have a foothold. All the big questions that bother us, why we suffer, why we die, and why we have to walk by faith rather than sight, all these are functions of the fact that we live in a universe that's still unfinished. And at that, in terms of that, then, if that's the case, then maybe it is that we cannot really find a full, divine, theologically acceptable solution to this problem of evil until the process itself has reached its full actualization. So it's sort of built in a way. But the thing about it is there is still hope, that evil is not the final word.
Maybe just to follow up on that, many people have criticized Teilhard that he minimalized evil or reduced it to something that seemed inconsequential. But I think we forget he was a stretcher bearer in World War I. He lived through profound suffering. He lost a number of his own family members to death. So he was a man fully aware of death and suffering. And so the charge that he was naively optimistic, I think, is a very unfair one. He did see, as Jack was saying, in an unfinished universe. In other words, suffering is, you might say, a stimulus to move on. In other words, it's a stimulus for new creativity. Even death itself. A death is not an opposite to life or something, contrast to life. It's, in a sense, a dimension of life itself. So that death or suffering and death are, you might say, stimuli to move forward, to move into more complex unions, to a new level of consciousness, to let go. Death is the letting go of isolated being to enter into more complex union in some ways. So death is part of life, and I think Teilhard, again, in that kind of, he's a broad thinker and a broad visionary. He's looking at death and suffering within this larger context of evolution and Christogenesis, without reducing it, without minimalizing it. He's saying it is part of life, but life is, in a sense, what we are being drawn into up ahead.
Any others?
I'm prompted by your very fine insights, Ilia, to think that the disgust and anger that would manifest itself as a problematic sign in the world. That I have had graduate students who have applied for grants to study Teilhard, and they have been refused by the granting agency, and the response that was given to them was, Teilhard de Chardin is the one that Stephen Jay Gould effectively dismissed by connecting him to the Piltdown hoax. That whole issue, and it's a very interesting one, too complex to go into a depth here, but there's been ample evidence now to explain how a particular clerk at the British Museum perpetrated those hoaxes against the director of the British National Museum. But Teilhard was associated by the major geologist of the late 20th century, Stephen Jay Gould, and that stain carries on. I feel anger, I feel disgust when the students are up against that. And when I read Teilhard, it passes, it evaporates, that feeling of disgust and anger. Because his work is significant, his work endures, and his work is that abiding capacity, abiding in reverence. And it's not simply the transcendent, although we have acknowledged the, say, the omega point, that which pulls us on. It's not just that. It's not just the material. He says, if I would lose my faith in Christ, in Jesus, if I would lose my faith in God, I would not lose my faith in the world. And Henri de Lubac makes such a beautiful interpretation of that. He was talking to his materialist scientist friends. He intentionally made a statement which is so jarring in terms of his sensibilities, but he could stand by it because it's not just materiality for him. It's a very complex conscious world where matter and spirit are pulling us forward in this interiority that lifts us out of disgust and anger.
John, just following up on that, I think that just speaks to me of Teilhard's deep incarnational spirit. His trust in the world is the trust that this world is not a planet that's isolated apart from God, that Omega is deeply at the heart of it. Love is deeply at the heart of it. So that Christianity is not just normative of religion, but normative of evolution itself, so that you can trust the world, you trust life. He speaks about resting on the future, Jack was talking about before. And we don't trust the world, I think, enough. We don't trust the stuff of the world.
I was just going to say, and that probably doesn't just follow, but don't you think one of our problems is individualism, that we think of ourselves as units, like of particles, where really we're much more connected than that. And so even with death, it's not about just my death. And even we were talking about Teilhard and what he's left here as a legacy. I mean, he didn't die in a certain sense. He's here with us. And so I don't know how to explore that too much more, but I think that's a piece of the problem of the Western world is the individualism. Anyway.
I've let this wonderful discussion flow to the point that I've essentially eliminated the opportunity for the audience to ask questions. But we're about to go into the St. William Chapel for the Mass on the World. And Kathy, you wrote a book on mysticism. Do you have any insights as to what the spirit was underlying the Mass on the World? Teilhard's writing of that essay. I'm just sorry to spring that question on you.
Well, I think he wanted to make a cosmic, when you think of the Mass, so here I come. Again, it's individualism. Here I come, I'm giving myself, I'm doing this, and I'm taking the host, and, well, maybe we're all connected here in this church. But he's trying to connect us to the whole cosmos in the Mass on the World. I mean, all the way from the beginning, he looks at the sun rising, and he's surrounded by the desert, and he just, he's using the whole earth as his altar, and the whole cosmos, So he's trying, I think, to change this very narrow view of spirituality into one that really makes sense, And he's offering himself in a very strong way, committing himself to make a difference in the world, actually, if you get, once you get to the communion.
Am I right in remembering he had no bread and wine, so the world?
Yeah, the altar was the world was the altar, and the bread and wine were the bread is all that the universe has made during this day, and the wine is all that all the sorrow that's in the world. So all of this is offered and transformed, and then then we give ourselves over to being part of that transformation. Yeah, it's a beautiful movement.
It talks about incarnation, not just being incarnation in the human flesh, but this goes well with your position. But the incarnation, oops. I tried to turn that off.
We told you he was here.
That's a warning for me to take my pills. I had back surgery a little bit ago, and that's... No, but the incarnation extends not just to Christ coming into the world, but Christ's extension extends to the whole world. So, thank you very much for coming, and a round of applause for our panel.